It's complicated?
Yes, it was complicated. And I had had my 3 children within 4 years.
Wow.
So I was a mother of young children. But I think really the genesis of Imagine Chicago began because I was at the tail end of a Kellogg National Fellowship, which I had been doing in the area of spirituality and leadership. And the issue that I had been particularly interested in was the interrelationship between ethics and economics. Because as a senior banking executive at First Chicago and as a priest and a practicing parish priest, I was asked quite frequently to speak about issues at the intersection of that. Some people would say there is no intersection between God and mammon, that we've been told, those are separate worlds and you have to choose between them. But I was living, of course, in that intersection. And so thinking a lot myself about God's economic imagination. What is God's economy? What do we know of God's economy from Scripture? And what do we know of the way we think about economy in a market-driven, secular society? I mean, the way we look at things. And also because I was living in worlds concurrently which didn't speak to each other. So pastoring a black church while I was banking multinational corporations, I was noticing that the issue of language in the city was highly problematic because different sectors held each other in so much suspicion and in many cases really didn't have a common language within which to talk about a common future. So you would hear people in the church talking about profit as a dirty word, without appreciating at all the investment that business was making in the quality of life in the city. And you would hear people in the business community talking with great disdain about government and how benighted the city politics was and how dirty it was and so on. And so I started thinking, really as a priest, about what the imagination was that had shaped our collective view of what was possible in the city. Chicago is a city, as you know, that's been really had a history of innovation as a city. We're a can-do sort of city. And I thought, what would it take for us to think about the city as a whole? Because as a student of Scripture, I know that God thinks about cities as a whole, judges cities as a whole. Our Scripture ends with a vision of the city, which is to come. It begins in a garden, but it ends in a city. So the city to me was the spiritual project. So I started thinking, what would it take for everyone to be in a common conversation and a common imagination about what was possible? And so I threw a conference at the end of my Kellogg Fellowship on faith, imagination, and public life, trying to understand the imagination and the history of the collective imagination of Chicago as a city. Asked a lot of the pioneers in the city that had done things against the odds, people of faith, to give perspective on the religious imagination. And what came out of that, the last night, was an exercise in which we talked about God's imagination for Chicago. Shorthand for things ultimately trustworthy and worthy of our own commitment as a community. And in capturing, as people of faith and people of prayer, in capturing in images what we thought God was at the heart of God's own yearning for Chicago as a community. I think we got, many of us, mobilized around what it would take then to act on behalf of that vision. The vision that came out for me in particular in that conference was of the Trinity as the recycling symbol, with a banner headline that said, "In God's economy, nothing and no one is wasted." So the question inside of me became, what would it take to organize our city in a way in which everyone had a place to belong and a way to contribute, in which everyone's contribution was valued and in which no one was wasted? And that began a process then with many other members who had been at the conference of looking at, what could happen. And we intuitively knew that it had to be a process that would be life-giving, that it would have to create more energy than it took, like a superconductor. And our instinct was that it would have to be grounded in very constructive dialogue. It would have to be intergenerational because the future would have to be visible in the equation if that's what we were concerned about. We wanted the future asking the question so that the future wasn't an abstract idea, but was an incarnate reality. And people would be accountable to the future in a new way. So I thought if you can get people accountable to kids who have been left behind in a new way, then perhaps we can have a different future than one where we seem to be headed now, where we can stand leaving lots of people out of the equation.
So by your meaning of kids that were left behind?
Well, take as an example, teenagers living in public housing. The images of them in the media would be very negative, very fearful. I mean, I think we'd gotten to a point in the city that a lot of people were afraid of teenagers. And I thought, what would it look like if we had a civic renewal process in Chicago that was led by teenagers in public housing? That's what we did.
Okay.
That's where we began. And what we decided to do as an initial act was to do an inquiry in the city, which we did in 40 neighborhoods of the city in 1993 and 1994, led by teenagers, most of whom lived in public housing, where they inquired of people across the city who were, we call them Chicago glue. We had
Chicago
people
glue?
We had people on the design team write down the names of 10 people that they think hold the city together against the odds. Glue people. And I said, we're no great respecters of position. If you want to include the mayor or the head of the civic committee on that list because you think they qualify, write down their name. On the other hand, I'm also very interested in the Kool-Aid grandmother on the block where all the kids come to her house after school because they know it's a safe haven and that she loves them. So we were looking for glue people. And we then got a small army of kids, 50 or 75 kids, who went out and used 9 questions to discover what the high points of these glue people's lives had been as citizens of the city. What stood out for them, why it had meant so much to them, what they saw, what they most longed for in terms of the city's future and what they thought it would take to accomplish.
These questions came from?
These questions came from a year-long design team process where we had started with a blank sheet of paper. And we then began quite carefully to compose questions that we thought would get at people's hopes and also at the possibility that they had seen, what they had been able to create and what they had been able to discover about the positive power of public life. And we designed the questions. Just about the time we finished them, someone mentioned that we really had to give a different role to kids, and we'd been toying with that, but we didn't have any kids on the design team. So we then field tested these questions with a large group of teenagers. As a result of that field test, we significantly changed the questions. They changed the questions. They said, this doesn't work, or you need to add this, or this isn't language we would use. And so when we went live with the interviews after this field test, which was all done in a group one afternoon, they were much better questions. And the kids, by that point, of course, had also noticed that we listened.
So
that they had
it really
changed.
was collaborative, and it was.
Yeah, and that they had really created a better process. That their contribution was already
happened.
being valued. So we had very high participation and ownership by the kids. And they got to pick who they wanted to interview. And we didn't have, in a year-long process, we didn't have one single kid miss an interview, not once. And it was all voluntary, and they had to get themselves to a central location to do it. So it was very exciting. So they conducted these interviews, and out of that, lots of people caught a vision of a new shared civic identity which crossed generations and crossed neighborhoods, because we were taking, an African-American kid to interview an Italian leader and an Italian kid to interview a Hispanic leader and so on. And for a lot of the kids, it was a great discovery to find out that leaders of communities that they had been taught to hold in suspicion had the same hopes for the future of the city that they did.
And have there been other kinds of impacts that have continued along? from this
Well,
project?
that was an early project, and what we discovered in that is that the way you talk to each other matters, and that you can set a different kind of renewing agenda by the questions you ask. We also discovered that it wasn't powerful enough because it didn't move to action. If I was interviewing you, there wasn't a way, an obvious way, for beyond the interview, for you to move in the direction that you now could see more clearly. You might do it. You might have been inspired to do it, but there wasn't an ongoing structure. So in 1995, we really reorganized Imagine Chicago around a set of very practical projects that had very visible outcomes and which had the process embedded, this understand, imagine, create process embedded, but which moved to very concrete outcomes. So we designed 6 projects, 5 of which got funded within the same month, and which we had to invent like crazy, which dealt with different organizations in the city, connecting them in ways that could shift what was possible in the city. And we saw a couple of arenas we thought were critical. One was that we needed to deal with public schools because we have 500,000 kids in public schools, and they've tended to be the dumping ground. They're sort of the schools of last resort in the city. So they often have in them the kids who is this future that we're most concerned about. Second is dealing with churches and community-based organizations. And third, with newcomers, new immigrants, because we're a port of entry for a lot of newcomer communities. So we designed multiple projects where those different communities and institutions could get involved in a process that was developmental for the individual involved, developmental for their community or institution, and which built a civic infrastructure, a network in the city of people vitally committed to the future of Chicago in particular, and where people could start to know each other across boundaries that otherwise wouldn't happen.